Shabbat Shalom to everyone. It's nice, wonderful seeing a sanctuary is filled this evening. How many people here would say they're computer literate? Okay, so no, computer literate. I'm being very serious.
What is literate?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so I only can say what I am, because I don't want to impose my standard on other people. I can turn on the computer. I know how to work all the Microsoft programs. I know how to get into the internet. I know how to connect other machines to this. I know how to set up a network. I know that if things go wrong, you turn the computer off and turn it back on and pray that it works. I know these things. Do I know things like programming or advanced problem solving? No, I don't. And the fact of the matter is, we know that if you don't have it coming out of school, our educational system has failed completely. And I have to remember that I didn't buy my first personal computer until I was in my 6th year of being a rabbi, so that just tells you how the world has changed. So I'm not going to worry about computer literacy tonight. I'm going to think about for a moment biblical literacy. I'm not speaking about being familiar with every page of the Bible. That's impossible. I'm not speaking about memorization because memorization has never been my thing. That's not realistic. What I'm thinking about is being acquainted with some of the important personalities of the Bible. And one needs it not just for one's own edification. It's important for our own understanding of world literature. It's certainly important for us to understand what it means for us to be Jews. Now, most of us know who Adam and Eve were. Most of us know the names of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But there are other basic personalities that we should also know. We should know who Jethro was, the father-in-law of Moses who guided him and encouraged him. We should know the name Korach, a person who led the rebellion against the authority of Moses and Aaron. We should know the name of Moses' mother, Yocheved. Yocheved. Bobby, did you know that?
No.
You should have just lied, because I already told you. The name Nathan, who spoke truth to King David, who had committed a terrible moral sin. The name Amos, who was the first Hebrew prophet and spoke fiercely against corruption and social injustice. Now, I could go on and on and on. And I remember in rabbinical school, where it was my final year and I had put this course off my entire rabbinical career, you had to take a course called Former Prophets, where they just give you a test on everything in the book of Joshua, the book of Samuel, the second book of Samuel, the book of Judges, the second book of Judges. And so if you didn't pass the test, you wouldn't graduate from rabbinical school. So I had a stack of index cards where I went through every page and tried to figure out what possible question could they ask. I went through it and I passed, and here I am. Okay. But knowing these, it makes sense. So many of the most important people and stories are missing from our Jewish awareness. But if I was to start anywhere, if I was to start, who would I teach beyond the people that we already know? I would definitely teach 2 people in our Torah reading. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not just setting this up because I needed a sermon this week. I really believe this. And I try to every year, and I've gone through the messages I've given over my 40 years of being a rabbi. I often mention this, but it's important. There are 2 minor characters in the first chapter of Exodus who are named Shifra and Puah. And every Jewish child and adult needs to know who they are. or they are missing an essential dimension of Judaism's moral vision. It's easy to miss them because they're mentioned only very briefly in the first chapter of Exodus, and they go on because the whole purpose of this section to tell us about Moses, how he was born, how he was saved, how he was selected by God. So there's not a lot of time given to these two people. So let me summarize who they were. The sons of Jacob thrived in Egypt, and they lived separately from Pharaoh, who was benevolent. And most probably, this Pharaoh loved the people, the Hebrews, because they respected Joseph. Then everything changes. There's a new Pharaoh, and the new Pharaoh sees the Israelites as a threat and decides to treat them harshly to limit their growth and strength. But the harsh treatment isn't sufficient. The new Pharaoh issues orders to kill newborn Hebrew boys. 2 midwives refuse to obey. And here's what the Torah says, and I'm going to read you everything we know about this story in a few lines. Quote, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the first whose name was Shiphrah and the second was named Puah, and he said, when you deliver the Hebrew women and you see them on the birthing stone, if it is a son, you shall kill it, and if it's a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt spoke to them, and they allowed the boys to live. And the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said, why have you done this thing that you have allowed the boys to live? And the midwives have no intention of going along. So Shiphrah and Puah said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are extremely vigorous, and before the midwife can arrive, they've already given birth. Now, that's a pretty bold lie to tell the Pharaoh. But you know what's amazing? Pharaoh backs off. These women. I have this image of Shiphrah and Puah, like the little old ladies. That's what I'm thinking. Now, there is some debate about Shiphrah and Puah, whether they were Hebrews or Egyptians. But I'm going to follow the wisdom of the commentators Josephus, Philo, Abravanel, that the midwives were Egyptians. Because in my opinion, they need to be Egyptian. Because you and I need to know that there are righteous people of all faiths in this world, and the Torah recognizes that. Here is a story of 2 Egyptian women willing to risk their lives to save Hebrew babies. These 2 women apparently understood that despite the totalitarian laws of Pharaoh, the despot of Egypt, there was a higher ethical law to which they had to submit. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the first record of citizens risking their lives against an unjust government to follow a higher law of conscience and God. And if they failed this moral challenge, they would have felt that they had sold out their souls. And the Torah states that the women disobeyed Pharaoh because they feared God. They were accountable to something greater than themselves. Now, in history, there have always been people who stand up for what is right, even if the consequences are unspeakable. And in the 20th century, as we all know, we discovered this in the righteous Gentiles, the Chasidei Umot HaOlam. The people who risked saving Jews, especially children, during the Holocaust. And Yad Vashem, the Israeli Center for Jewish Historical Memory of the Holocaust, has identified that there were 28,217 righteous Gentiles. They have records. They're very record-oriented. So I'm not going to talk about this 27,000 people, obviously, but let us remember the name of one of them who died in June 2022, a modern-day Shiphrah and Puah. And this woman's story is amazing. Andrea Gulen was a Belgian school teacher who saved the lives of hundreds of Jewish children during the Holocaust, holding their hands and comforting them with stories as she spirited them to hiding places where they stayed until liberation. Ms. Gulen was an 18-year-old Catholic-born teacher when Hitler conquered Belgium in 1940. And despite the wartime deprivations, her life carried on more or less as usual until she began to witness the cruelties visited upon her Jewish students. And one day, several Jewish students arrived at school with their notebooks held tightly against their chests, and they were trying to hide the yellow stars sewn on their uniforms in accordance with a Nazi decree. And to lessen their shame and fear, Ms. Gulen declared that all her students, Jewish or not, would wear aprons over their uniforms. If only in the confines of her classroom, a yellow star, its presence or absence, was no matter. And shortly after, Ms. Gulen's Jewish students began to disappear. And they had been rounded up, bound for deportation to Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp in occupied Poland. And she stated in an interview, at that very moment, I said to myself, what can I do to help? What can I do? Ms. Gulen joined the underground and devoted herself to the rescue of Jewish children. Ms. Gulen, under a code name, it's like a spy novel when you read about her, escorted Jewish children to farms, convents, boarding schools, and the homes of host families, where she and her colleagues in the resistance had arranged for them to live under assumed Christian identities. And what Ms. Gulen described as an indispensable security measure, under no circumstances did she reveal to parents where she was taking their children, lest the parents be tempted to visit and risk the entire mission. And she recalled one mother impressing upon her, I'm trusting you with the most precious gift that I have. In a complex series of ledgers, and I don't quite understand it after reading the story, but according to this complex bunch of ledgers, Ms. Gulen and her colleagues recorded the true names of the children in their care, their assumed names and their locations, but in such a manner that no single notebook, should it fall into the wrong hands, would reveal their whereabouts. Of the 300 to 400 lives Ms. Gulen was credited with saving, some of them had scarcely begun. The youngest of the children she rescued were newborns, 5 or 6 days old, Shifra and Pua, lifted them from the arms of their mothers in hospital maternity wards, and taken to places where they would be safe, or at least safer until the Nazi danger passed. Her underground group worked with a doctor who would inform them when a Jewish woman had given birth and wished to surrender the child for safekeeping. In an interview, she said, taking children that way from a mother who was just given birth is terrible. Getting onto a train with Jewish children, knowing that the Germans could get on, that didn't frighten me. But to tear a child away from his mother and not tell her where we were taking her, and then to have her cry and cry, tell me at least, only tell me where you're going to take him, that was horror. And she added, if I'd had children then, I don't know if I could have done it. Now, some of those babies, like other children rescued by Ms. Gulen, would be united with their families after the war. But many of their parents were murdered in the concentration camps. Meeting decades later with one of the children she had helped, Ms. Gulen spoke to the man of his mother and his mother's anguish on leaving him before her ultimate death. She let you go and saved your life. So on this Shabbat, let us remember Shifra and Pua, who might not be known to some of us. They're known now. And talk about them. They showed us what we can do at our best. And let every Jewish child and Jewish adult know those names. And may Shifra and Pua force us to ask the question, what would we do? And what risks would we take to do what is righteous and holy? Shabbat Shalom.